I'm John Mitchell and I'm the director of ALNAP, and I have a question for Kim. Now, why Kim? Well, the reason is that Kim and the gentleman on my left here, Ben Ramelingham, wrote the first ever study on humanitarian innovations, and that came out in 2009. And I remember in that study you identified 4 good ideas and concepts that we thought were innovative at the time. But it was quite a difficult thing to do because there wasn't a lot of it around in those days. Now, in 2009, 7 years later, I think Kim has probably had his eye on the evolving innovation landscape closer than most people. And I wanted to ask you, do you think that the humanitarian sector now is a more fertile environment for innovations? And if it is, why? What's changed? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Other questions? Over here in the front row.
Hi, I'm Nicholas Meller. I'm an entrepreneur that's been led innovations both in the private and the public sector. In the private sector, you've got a host of venture capital people you can go and have a coffee with any day you like. In the public sector, you've got requests for proposals or criteria or biannual requests for funding. And what I've found in the humanitarian field is that it's all about timing and a crisis. And people have very limited attention span. And so you have to be able to respond at that particular moment when you've got that particular partnership. And today, I was talking, I've just come from an Ebola lessons learned lesson, and we developed a simulated training system for healthcare workers, inspired partly by the avionics industry, to say, look, how can we provide high fidelity training at scale? And there was a request, could we get it into Angola within the next 4 weeks and find a way of adapting it to? And within the humanitarian environment, who can you go to make that request? Thank you.
Thank you. One more, and then we'll... Jess?
Sorry, hi, Jess, Director of ELRA. I feel a bit bad it's me and John speaking first. My question really is for Jamila and maybe Alice as well, and it's about the use of professional communities for scaling up. I feel that that's potentially something that we're really missing a trick on, in that when you look at other professional sectors like the health sector or the education sector, there's a very strong relationship between research, evidence, and professional development, continuous professional development. And are we missing utilising some of the networks that are there, or do we need to build more professional networks in order to get away from the need for organisations to buy into new innovations, but actually we use a professional community to learn and iterate and develop?
Okay, thank you very much. Let's start with those 3, and then I'll take 3 from our online audience. Kim, do you want to address John's question?
Yeah, and I think the answer is yes and no. I think undoubtedly...
Depends.
Undoubtedly, there's more funding available for innovation, and many more organisations now have either innovation units or people whose jobs is to either do innovation or to support the organisation to do innovation. And we've got many more examples of new kinds of partnerships bringing in new technologies and new ideas. And so that's really positive. And I think that has led to lots of instances of change at the project or program level, and some of those at a reasonable scale. The no is that I don't think we've seen that lead to the more transformative change that we would like to see, and I think perhaps naively thought would follow on from this sort of wellspring of activity. I think in the original report, there were 2 areas where we cited as potential paradigm innovations, these sort of innovations that change the system. One was around accountability, and the other one was around risk-first approaches, DRR approaches, and so on. And we've seen, I would say, very little progress in either of those areas over that period. And that's challenging, but that is because it's those systemic blocks. It's the lack of incentives to really prioritise accountability. It's the responsive funding model of the system which inhibits those kind of big changes taking place. I think the danger is that in lieu of our ability to deliver on those systemic issues, we get really caught up in the sort of techno-fetishism and the little instances of, oh, look, this app allows us to contact these people, or this mobile phone allows Mr. Sokol to text message the UN, and we get really focused on those in lieu of our ability to actually do the systemic change to make us more accountable or to make us more proactive.
Did you want to comment on that, Alice, or any of the other questions?
Yeah, well, quickly on the private-public sector one, I think that goes back to this point about having to build those relationships early on so that when you have a crisis, then you can kind of activate an innovation or utilize that partnership effectively. But also, I think from what we saw in terms of piloting in emergencies, there was some mixed evidence that came out from experiences. On the one hand, there were those cases where they piloted in an emergency and there were a lot of difficulties in doing so, and the innovating team walked away from that experience feeling like, well, maybe we actually shouldn't pilot until we have a more developed prototype, because we're overtaxing or overburdening our field staff with something that has some bugs in it, right? And we don't want to get these quick iterations back from them because they don't have time to provide us with those quick feedback loops that we would need to create further iterations. So that's one point, but I think the Ebola crisis seemed to stick out as a huge exception to all of that, because that was a case, I think Words of Relief is one, but also the case study of the World Food Program, who were in the middle of redesigning their food security surveys using SMS technology, and didn't really have firm plans in place to pilot that. They were also working long-term with private sector partners on this. Then the Ebola crisis happened. They couldn't do their face-to-face food security surveys, so they had to do it, right? So there's this one sense in which the right crisis, quote unquote, not nice to talk about it in that way, but the right crisis comes along that has an appropriate context where that innovation is really needed, and the risk is such that it's actually better to try it rather than to try nothing at all, because we can't do our current practices. On the point about professional communities, maybe if I'm understanding correctly what you mean by professional communities, because I think there were some examples where it seemed like that professional communities in the tech world, for example, were really critical for developing an innovation, not so much for diffusion, it seemed, although I think timing there is an issue. So there's been a lot of cases where there have been diffusion activities through professional networks, but it's not clear whether or not that's actually leading to uptake, primarily because, as we talk about in the report, you need to look at end users in your innovation process, but also the gatekeepers. And oftentimes professional networks are end users, but there's other gatekeepers to adopting that innovation within their organization that you have to be addressing. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it seemed that professional networks were much more critical for the development of an innovation than for diffusion thus far.
Jamila?
Yeah, I just wanted to address the question from basically that certainly in Angola that the local organizations we can talk we can partner with the Red Cross, but I think this whole thing about venture capital mindset, I have to be very careful because I may be politically incorrect. Okay, there is a really inherent hesitation from the humanitarian community working with private sector. Sometimes I can't understand it because it's almost like taboo to work with the private sector. It's changing slowly, but it's still a lot of suspicion and anxiety. Now, one of my good friends, you may know him, Gisli Olafsson, he's a humanitarian. He used to be Microsoft, and he was leading the Net Hope. He's actually gone the other way around, gone to Silicon Valley now with basically matching venture capital investors, venture capitalists with ideas from the humanitarian sector, because he feels that that's the way to scale up, to really get this idea. So it'll be interesting to see how this develops, because I think, should we not have a dragon's den kind of thing for innovation in the humanitarian sector, where we actually pitch some of these ideas and get people to invest? So again, I think we should, but there are people who will say no. Jess, on your question, I was trying to understand it, but what I think is that yes, we should, especially for example in health, water sanitation. Why aren't we reaching out to the other professional networks who deal with this day in and out? And when you really go outside our sector to really build those networks and those partnerships to help us understand better, because I think sometimes, one of my self-criticisms, humanitarians love self-flagellation, is that, sometimes we talk too much to ourselves. And then we look at things from one perspective. And I think it's always good to talk to professional networks. But I agree with you, it's usually in the development phase and so forth. In the diffusion part, when, will they actually find our innovations useful? That's another thing. But, we could reach a point where there could be some innovative solutions that could be applied. So I still think the more partnerships, the more networks you have, the better. Yeah.
Thank you, Jamila.
I just want to make a quick comment about the whole venture capital investment. It's not that you can, in the private sector, that you can just keep going back to the venture capitalists. You can't. You better have your idea sewed up, and you better figure out a way to sustain it, because you just can't keep going back. So I think that's a fallacy that the money is just there when the crisis happens in private as well. We were able to get seed money to create an innovation outside of the crisis, looking at it in a non-crisis situation. And then one of our number one goals was to figure out how to make it sustainable. And you can't, so that when Ecuador happens, or when something happens around the world, we can react in 2 hours without worrying about the funding. So I think that I don't think it's that different. I think that there needs to be the availability of seed funding. It needs to be open and flexible, like it is in the venture capital. But you need to prove yourself, just like you do in the private.
Could I come in on?
Sure.
Yeah, I think it's been sort of alluded to, but the key difference is we're dealing with public and not private money, and so you have to be more transparent, you have to be more open. I think it would be naive to think that venture capitalists don't have very thorough criteria that they're using to assess the things that are coming across their desk, or that they're not going through very rigorous due diligence on the things that they're putting money to. The fact that they can go and negotiate their deals over lunch is because it's private money, and I think we need to have open and transparent processes, and that does raise some of the barriers to entry, but that's just a fact of life. But I think really most of the things that we're providing funding to aren't going to be profit-making ventures ever, and that's why the venture capitalists aren't interested in them, and we need to recognise that.
Okay, thank you. I've got lots of questions from our online audience, so I just want to read out a few of those and ask our panelists to respond. The first one is from Karen Kissakenny Sorensen from the Danish Demining Group. And actually, this was one of the case studies in the ALNAP HIF report. And Karen also wrote an article for the Humanitarian Exchange about this. So her question is, and this is in very small print, so I'm a bit challenged here.
My glasses.
Yes, I know. I'm afraid of losing them all. What are your reflections on whether some humanitarian contexts are more suitable for early stages of innovation? And she says, from the Danish Demining Group's experiences with its innovation project in Ukraine, an ethical question emerging was requesting the vital partnerships with national partners. I think she means concerning the vital partnerships with national partners, both government duty bearers and affected communities, to take part in our experiment without having evidence that the innovation would actually improve the current modes of action. So would some contexts actually be considered inappropriate? So that's one question. Are you all right for me to ask a couple here? Let's see here. Another question which comes from Rebecca Moreno is, and it's a comment too, is that all interventions should ideally have a successful exit strategy. I mean, you can call it scale up or handover. However, in my experience as UNHCR Innovation Lab Manager, this is something that is done very organically. What are your ideas on systematizing this from the innovation perspective, taking into consideration, as you well mentioned, that it's not like the standard humanitarian program management? Is that clear?
So it's on scale up and handover, making that more systematic.
Exactly. And then one more for the moment, and this one is from Loic Peters, and excuse me if I've mispronounced your name, from Human Surge. How is humanitarian innovation different from modern day startups, if at all? So that's a short one. So who should I start with? I think,
I'm happy to start. if you
Alice?
like. Yep.
yeah.
So I'm really glad to hear Karen's question. Hello to Karen. That's the last case study that we're going to be publishing this month on the Danish Demining Group's innovation. And just to give a bit of background on that case, because it's a really interesting one, Danish Demining Group has been developing an online portal in partnership with the Ukrainian government, the state emergency services, in order to provide better two-way communication with Ukrainian civilians on the locations of mines and unexploded objects. So it's a really compelling innovation, and one that's done in a conflict setting, trying to build in long-term sustainability with a huge degree of risk. So it's been an interesting one to look at. And I think there that case offers or reflects a general theme that we saw across a lot of the innovations, which is this catch-22 of trying to consult with stakeholders and do user-centered design, but those users also want to see something tangible before they engage with you. So how do you balance the need to, or the desire to really to have your innovation informed from user input, but then also try to engage users who don't want to engage unless they know that this is going to lead to something tangible or concrete down the line. We talk about that a bit in the report. There's no clear answers to it, but one of the common approaches that we saw again was trying to develop this innovation at a global level or in another context, so that you know that it works to some degree, and then bringing it in to tailor it to a local context so you can show something tangible. On the scale up and handover and making it more systematic, I don't think there will ever be a one size fits all approach to this. We've identified 4 different types of, scaling strategies, as we've called them. Other people call them business models that you can use to scale or diffuse your innovation. We've identified those as a taxonomy, but there could be further work done to explore the different techniques or factors that are used to make each of those successful. And a lot of it's going to depend on the type of innovation you're trying to develop and the type of change you're trying to achieve.
Thanks, Alice. Jamila?
Well, I think the question is, are all environments suitable for innovation? Absolutely not. I think there will be environments that are easier for us to look at innovation, particularly in prolonged crisis, protracted crisis, chronic, where you have time really to think about the problem and identifying that and creating a solution. But in some situations where it's also dangerous to be innovative, I think we need to be very mindful that innovation is not the end, it's a means to end. I think, in terms of scaling up, handover, making it more systematic, definitely. I think that's where we have a lot of challenges, to be honest, because, we can come up with really good innovative ideas, but sometimes we have real difficulty scaling up. And then, this is where I go back to local communities and local innovation, because it's critical. Those can be sustained, because if the communities own it and are able to deal with it and themselves maintain it and keep improving it, then chances are it will survive. It will keep evolving and keep innovating. And I have to disagree with Alice, because I think that it's not about creating global innovations and bringing it down, because it may be completely 2 different things. It could be things which are meant to be global, and some things which are meant to be just local. And we shouldn't we shouldn't keep wanting to scale up everything, because I think some things will work in those environments, and that's all they need.
Well, just to be clear, you don't have to always do it that
That's
way.
right.
That's why there's different models,
That's
different
right.
approaches.
That's right.
So they don't really disagree.
Yeah. So maybe I'll stop there.
Okay, great. Rebecca?
I actually agree with Alice in most regards with that, in that having a global understanding on a global level is extremely helpful, and then customizing using the local players. The Ukrainian example is actually, I haven't actually talked to them, but from a language standpoint, it's a massive issue. We wouldn't even touch that unless that was in Ukrainian and in Russian. So that's just an example how what we do is in West Africa, or what we do in Greece isn't going to work necessarily work in Ukraine. So it has to be both.
Kim, Would you like to address the question about humanitarian innovation? Is it different from startups?
Yeah, the answer is I've never worked in a startup, but sometimes it certainly feels like it if it means that you're sort of trying to do too much with too little. I think the challenge is with both with innovations and with the innovation agenda is that you're trying to do what you're doing, but also be demonstrating the value of it to people who are sometimes quite skeptical. And I think that where you don't have the traditional kind of output metrics, which in the private sector would be your ability to turn a profit or your ability to kind of generate revenue towards turning a profit. When you don't have those, you're scrabbling around for other indicators of success, and that's very time consuming and hard. And so, I think there's a lot of similarities, and I think whilst we shouldn't sort of fetishize the private sector's ability to innovate, I think that kind of entrepreneurial culture is something that the humanitarian sector could learn a lot from.
Okay, thank you. We've got about 10 minutes left, or slightly under 10 minutes. I've got another question here I just wanted to pose from our online audience, and then are there a couple more in the room? Let's take somebody from the far back, the very back row, so we can...
Thank you. My name is Willemijn Geldorp from iAdjusters. We make self-adjustable glasses. I have one for you if you want to read the questions. But,
Thank you. I've already got my contact lenses in.
I wanted to ask, I'm sorry to not try to make the HIF on the spot, but what I find difficult as an organization trying to get funding, I spend a very long time preparing funding and describing well what the innovation is that I'm trying to bring. And after spending weeks on an application, the answer is, thank you for applying, regretfully have no time to give you feedback. So what is that for a feedback loop? And so I'd say to you, not because you're the only one who does that, I think that all funds do that. So how is an organization trying to raise funds? Do you recommend, does anyone have tips? How do you improve your application if you don't know what's wrong with it? Maybe the year was great, but just not this year, I don't know. So what can an organization do to improve their feedback, and what can we, with that feedback, do to improve our applications?
Okay, thank you very much. Let's take this gentleman here, and then I'm going to call on Ben in the front row.
Hello, my name is Aidan McGuire, and I have a private sector background, but I'm actually here for HDX, which is on your project for Hexel. And I just wanted to ask the panel's opinion about teams.
Thank you.
So in my observation, having worked in innovation for a period of time, there is a tendency for technology to lead and for technologists to lead. But my observation is actually that it's the balance between non-technologists and technologists that makes for successful innovation. I'd just be curious in the panel's opinion.
Thank you very much. And Ben.
Great, thank you. Great report.
Just wait for the microphone, thank you. Yeah.
Both great reports, both the ALNAP HIF report and the HBN journal article collection. I guess my question is really about institutions and the way that the humanitarian institutions are evolving to deal with innovation. We actually know quite well, when we look at the history of innovation, it doesn't matter if we look at the public sector or the private sector, there is always a lag between the introduction of a technology and the adaptation of an institution to take advantage of it. There's no better example of this than the introduction of electricity. So in the second industrial age, which happened about 120 years ago, electricity was brought into steam factories. And the managers that brought them in essentially had what replaced the single big steam engine with a single big electrical engine. And they didn't change any of the norms, they didn't change any of the practices, they just went, right, okay, we'll bring electricity in. And there was no increase in productivity, there was no increase in results. It took a generation of managers to retire, a new generation to come in and work out new norms, new practices, and essentially the fact that with electricity you get much smaller engines, you could move towards mass production. That took a generation to happen in the private sector. So I guess my question is really about the institutions of the humanitarian sector. Are we set up to do this well? Or is innovation an idea that is coming to our sector, which is actually going to see the creation of a new kind of system which can actually do this better? And I'd like to pose that to everyone, actually.
Thank you very much. I'm going to, because we only have technically about 6 minutes left, I'm going to ask our panelists to be as concise as possible. But I'm going to start actually with Jamila.
I think HIF does a really good job in giving feedback, well, from what I remember. So I maybe it's a different organization you're talking about. And I don't know how to use these glasses. But Ben, you know, you're absolutely right in asking that question. Number one, I think that speaking for myself, you know, I think a lot of the people in the humanitarian sector don't evolve. They stay there forever and ever. So how do you bring new ideas into an organization and new skills? You know, there's always a thinking that humanitarians are a certain type of people, but why can't everyone be humanitarian? We just need to train them on principles and so forth. But bringing young people into you know, humanitarian organizations that will actually bring new ideas. Now, should we, from what I understand from your question, should innovation be farmed out to other people to deal with it? I don't think we've tried that. And I dare say that in a couple of years, there might be people like yourself coming to say, you know what, you have that problem, let me figure it out for you and come back to you, rather than we struggle and put our resources into that. So I think it will come. This is my own thinking.
Thank you very much. Rebecca.
Well, just to play on that, I think, yeah, you absolutely could farm it out, but you have to have the culture inside. You absolutely have to have that mindset inside that that you're willing to change and innovate. So I really think it's a combination. You shouldn't be creating all the new ideas yourself anyway, right? I mean, you should be farming some out. I think the feedback question's a good question. Sorry, as someone who's written a lot of grants, I think the private sector does a whole lot better in providing feedback. They'll tell you right out, this is, you know, this is what's wrong with your proposal, boom, 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 boom. And not sure I see that so much in the grants we've written.
Kim, right of reply.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to deal with it head on, and I think it relates to the previous question around our functions. I mean, we're tiny and we don't have the capacity to provide feedback in detail to the hundreds of applications we get in every round. The way we do it is for those proposals that get to our final shortlist, which is usually about 15, we provide very detailed. For the slightly longer list of proposals that get through the first phase, which is usually about 30 or 40 per round, we provide brief feedback, and that we're not able to provide feedback for the other, I don't know, 75 to 100 that we get twice a year. And that's just a question of capacity and how we prioritize our resources. If we spent time collating and sharing feedback for all of those, we wouldn't be able to run our grant-making program and get out funds to the successful ideas that we do want to support. So I agree it's not ideal, but that's, you know, that's the realities that we're working under.
And we did get that at that stage. That was very good.
And to your point, I think maybe there is more frankness with private sector donors about saying we don't like this idea, so, and this is why.
We haven't developed it enough.
You know, maybe we could be more frank in some of the negative feedback that we provide. Certainly, we can look into that.
It's not it's so nice.
And I think it's partly too because the humanitarian sector is often quite a closed circle of all people who know each other or organizations that are known. So that's a challenge, I think, for all of us to overcome at times. Do you want to comment on Ben's
well, first on the
question?
point about technology, I think there's a function that's missing in a lot of the humanitarian sector, which is that, which is the kind of, what would you call it, the sort of, the relational piece. Alice, you have a term, the translational piece between the technology and the program bits, which has a term in the private sector which is now slipping my mind. But that function is often not existent in organisations, which makes it hard to do that technology translation, which I think leads to a lot of problems. On Ben's bigger question, I think perhaps we've been really unrealistic about the timeframes and the costs associated with innovation, and are expecting some of the things that are going to take decades to be done in years with very small budgets. And if we look at the amounts of money that are really required to do change at scale, we've probably been really unrealistic about that. In terms of institutions, I think even when there are those sort of very long timeframes in business, there are very clear imperatives around profit that drive that improvement, and that's why you see it over time, even if there are bureaucratic hindrances to that, and bureaucracies have those tendencies to protect themselves and to sustain themselves and to push away change. We don't have those in the humanitarian sector, so I think that it's going to be more difficult, and I think there will be, I think there will be a sort of creative destruction where some agencies that aren't prepared to engage with their mandate, which aren't prepared to engage with some of these big challenges, do fall by the wayside. I think that will happen, and the challenge for those of us in the system is to protect the bits that we think are good around the principles, for the extent that we do uphold them, around do no harm, around some of the standards that we've developed over the last 15 and 20 years, and maintain that in new institutional environments, because I think they will change.
Thank you, Kim. And Alice, you get the last word.
Oh, great. Thank you, Wendy. I'll make it a very short word. Just on the technology point, it's a really important issue, and one we do talk about in the report, and just something that needs to be looked at more by humanitarian actors and getting that translation capacity on board, but also being less afraid of technology and more confident to make demands on technology developers and to look to technology developers for solutions and not shy away from them. On Ben's point, I guess what I was thinking there was electricity is quite an interesting example because we don't get innovations like that very often in human history, really, right? So I think there the question is about analogy. So are we talking in humanitarian innovation about moving from steam to electricity, or are we talking about getting, to use Paul Knox Clark's, analogy, are we getting better toasters? Are we getting better electronic equipment? And I think we shouldn't kind of downgrade those so-called incremental innovations because stacked up over time and looking at their long-term impact, they could be quite transformative. So I think even if the space isn't there to bring about those huge shifts, there might be a lot of things that add up. The whole might be better than the sum of its parts at the end of the day. So that's my positive end. Yeah.
Thank you, Alice. Thank you very much. I'm afraid we're going to have to end here because we're out of time, and I apologize to the people online. We had a couple of more questions there we could have asked. But I just wanted to thank our panelists for the excellent presentations and the very stimulating discussion that we've had today, and to all of you as well, both in the room and watching online. And I hope you will take away copies of the report. You can also find the report and the Humanitarian Exchange online on the ALNAP and also on the HIF websites. ELRA website, and you can find the exchange on the HPN website. So thank you all very much for coming. I hope you'll join us outside to continue chatting, and you can see a video recording of the event online in a few days' time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wendy.